You're listening to a Very Spatial podcast, episode 737, May 5th, 2024.
I grew up in Idaho, and I feel loved.
Hello, welcome to our Very Spatial podcast. I'm Jesse.
I'm Sue.
I'm Barb.
And this is Frank.
And this week we're going to be talking about something that I don't know if we've ever talked about before, but that's after the news.
First up in the news, the FCC has voted to reinstate net neutrality rules in the United States. Now, this is one of those kind of on again, off again situations. Net neutrality was taken away by the previous administration. It was first put in place by not the previous, but the one before that in 2015. And then it was rescinded largely under the previous administration. And then that kind of laid in sort of stasis for a number of years until there was a party shift within not just the administration, but within the FCC itself, because FCC, what are they called? Appointees. I don't know. I called commissioners, I guess. They are put in for a certain period of years before, they get reinstated. And the Biden administration appointed additional Democratic representatives, and that led to a 3-2 vote to reinstate net neutrality. So what does that mean for the United States? It just means that the FCC now has the ability to regulate the internet as a common carrier, which gives them a lot more power to say, this is what you can do and what you can't do. This is what you can do in terms of charging, in terms of minimum standards, in terms of access, and in terms of pushing it out to places that do not currently have what we would call good internet connection, broadband to use the vernacular. So it's a pretty powerful thing. And I think it's fair to say most of us at VerySpatial, all of us at VerySpatial think it's critical, and I'm glad that they've reinstated it. However, one of the challenges here is that it does highlight that this stuff is very changeable from administration to administration. And there's been attempts to try to codify this into law. Unfortunately, in the congressional level, the bill just didn't go very far. So hopefully in the future that'll change. Some states have tried to do it. California has a law that sort of imposes net neutrality, but there's always been a fight between what's the FCC federal ability to regulate and the state ability to regulate. There's a couple bills. There's a couple of Supreme Court cases that are addressing the idea of regulation. And it's going to be interesting how that shakes out, and this could have a secondary side effect. But for now, we have net neutrality again, which is awesome.
And the pandemic was a big driver of this because it highlighted the need to close the digital divide, because of the situation of everyone being asked to be online, but not everyone having the capability or access to do that.
Yeah, I like the quote from the commissioner that it went from nice to have to need to have. Right, I think that pretty much sums it up.
Yeah, but my issue is it went from nice to have to need to have, like in 2004.
It is true.
We're
yeah.
just now figuring that out, which is a little frustrating.
Yeah. Next up in the news, of course, with everything that's been going on with AI, and there's just so much involved in that. But one of the things is that, governments, not just here in the United States, but other places, are trying to figure out not just how they might have to get into it in terms of legal structure stuff, but also how government agencies will use these types of systems themselves. So recently, the White House here in the United States has actually laid out AI guidelines for how government here will use AI. So what they have to do in terms of telling people how they're using it, what they're using it for, and appropriate safeguards. So this policy has basically 3 general requirements. So just really quick. And this is kind of pretty standard, I think, with a lot of tools when, the government adopts technology. So the first requirement is that federal agencies here in the U.S. will need to ensure that any AI tools that they are using aren't going to endanger the rights and safety of the American people. So that's a quote, right? And this is, again, pretty standard. So they'll have to have safeguards in place. They'll have to have procedures to make sure that they're not using a tool that potentially could cause problems in that sense. And then they'll have to also, as part of that, have to be transparent about what AI systems they're using in government agencies. And so they'll be required to each year publish a list of the systems, how they're assessing risk, and how they're managing risk. And then finally, To accomplish all of this, there will be internal oversight of AI use in federal agencies through a chief AI officer. So putting into place a structure, because as we've seen everywhere right now, right, it's advancing much more rapidly than the understanding of implications, right, of impacts of using generative AI and these tools, which are already being used across quite a few things. And so I believe the AI governance board, so that structure part of it has to be in place by nearly the end of May. So the chief AI officer and anybody else that's going to be responsible in that part. And presumably, lists will be compiled, those types of things will begin, probably may have already begun, but if not, shortly.
Interesting. They have to have this done by December 1st, which is an unusual date, but that's,
Well, everybody takes off December because they've built up all their annual leave. So, you have to get it done before you all go on vacation.
Yeah. And before this year's over.
you would typically expect this stuff to go into place, the first of the year type of thing, or first of the fiscal year, which would be October 1. The really interesting thing here is that is just under 30 days after the election. So this is all done by executive order. So the complicating factor here is we don't know right now what the outcome of the election is going to be. And who's to say this wouldn't be rescinded on January 22nd, which would be 2 days after.
But until then,
So that's the interesting bit. But
Well, what was interesting to me was everything they were talking about is highly spatial. We know geographers and geospatial people working in the areas of water systems, elections, emergency services, right down to when they're talking about transportation, medicine, and law enforcement settings. So this is definitely something that impacts the geospatial community and their respective agencies. So UNESCO has added 18 more sites to the UNESCO Global Geoparks Network. This brings the total number of parks to 213 in 48 countries. I was working that out because it's greater than the number of countries, but it's concentrated within 48 countries, but they're hoping to expand that. The new geoparks are Brazil, China, Croatia, Denmark, Finland, France, Greece, Hungary, Portugal, Poland, and Spain. And the images are just gorgeous when you look at them. And then they also have added a new transboundary geopark that's going to span Belgium and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Started in 2015, the geoparks are a way to preserve our geologic heritage, both in terms of reaching out to the public, but also sustaining it and preserving it and doing some good practices with conservation. So it's pretty exciting to see. And, this is a great idea. The geoparks are an attraction, but they're also a way to preserve our geology and geography, or physical geography of the world.
Well, you say physical geography, but really it's just as much the cultural geography, because these things are highlighting the physical aspects, but it brings in people. So you get tourism, you get economic change, you get the kind of cultural conversation about how this particular geologic feature impacts or has driven these communities. So there's a lot of human and physical geography tied up in what ostensibly is a geologic park. But, I think the name geopark fits it better because it does incorporate a lot of the geography.
and the ones that have already been named, there's some of the sort of most iconic, unique landscapes and natural formations around the world. And just the list is just amazing. I mean, if you wanted to put a bucket list, where are just amazing places I'd want to go in the world, I think that it would be a good place to start, is to just look at some of those.
yeah, you really owe it to yourself to check out the link in the show notes and look at the pictures. They're, like Barbara said, astounding. But my favorite is where the Yellow River interacts with the other river in China. And it's just, it's amazing contrast to see those two come together.
Next up, a little bit different. So we often talk about the importance, the infrastructural nature of things like OpenStreetMap. But at the same time, it's also open and anybody can participate in it. And so what happens whenever you have infrastructural with, I want to change this. And recently, Pokemon Go has given folks a reason to go in and change it. So Pokemon Go, of course, an app that's been around for a few years now that people have been utilizing. Great, gets people out. Lots of wonderful things to say about it. But one of their recent updates, there is a new Pokemon who's only showing up in beach areas. And instead of spoofing, like many people have done traditionally, their location, instead they're going in and editing OpenStreetMap, which Pokemon Go pulls from for its base map data, and putting beaches in places where beaches weren't before or aren't in real world. So yeah, we get this infrastructural data set that's suddenly seeing the increase in beaches around the world.
Yeah, the presumption is that people will do this in good faith, for good intent, and that's not always true. I mean, this is a silly reason, obviously, but it does raise the question of what's being done subtly different for geopolitical reasons or whatever it may be, and that's the dangers to this. So it's great, but also it's it needs guardrails, arguably.
What's funny to me when I read it is I've recently watched an interview with the creator of OpenStreetMaps, and then he talks about maps as entertainment, and here it's actually collided with actual entertainment. But the other thing is I feel like this really wants to be a John Green book or novel about adding these beaches.
You're going to have to explain what John Green is for everybody.
No, that's okay. People can go to YouTube and find him and Hank and enjoy their time doing that. Or go and see Turtles All the Way Down or Up. Whichever one that it is that came out this week.
I don't know.
The movie version of the book, sorry. To continue on with the data thing. Overture Maps, which of course we spoke with them not that long ago, maybe 6-8 months ago, about their foundational data set that they're working with a lot of different organizations to provide this accessible, though not open, data set. They are basically rolling it out now in a beta version. So they've been, slowly building up and adding things to it and making clear that, it wasn't ready for prime time yet, even though anybody could use the data they were making available at that time. But now they are to the point where they are releasing the beta of the production ready 1.0 version of Overture Maps. So if you're interested, go over, check it out. You can download it from various sources, as well as I think there's a couple of places where you can go ahead and connect to it through various calls. So I'll leave that for you to figure out where those are if you want to take advantage of it. But, most importantly here, places of interest, buildings, transportation, administrative boundaries, and their base land and water data set are the ones that are going to be part of this 1.0 version.
In 40 different languages, so they're going to support international use.
So head over and check it out.
And that's it for the news.
Now, yes, this is weird. Sue probably hasn't even seen the link yet. And this is a word that I came across today. I don't think, ever talked about before. And with that, it's one that may have been around for a while. It's one that is curious and does have potentially an impact on the way that we talk about these things, but nobody's really talking about the term metageography. This term apparently comes from two sources, one in 1997, which is actually the second one, not the Russian one that we'll talk about later on. This is all according to Wikipedia, by the way, where it's a set of spatial structures through which people order their knowledge of the world. Okay, so it's our understanding of geography. It's the ontologies, it's the epistemologies, it's how we understand it, right? Is that how you guys would take that?
Yes. And I know we haven't talked about this before because this is the first time I've ever interacted with this word before that I know of. So I certainly, but we may have to, I think it's fair to say we've talked about the concept without necessarily the term, maybe obliquely or around the concept, but.
Oh, a few times.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. The interesting bit for me, the 97 book is a critique of metageography. Is a longer title, but which suggests that the term predates the critique, right?
In theory, but again, that comes back. We could say that the 1969 Soviet geographers wrote that metageography is concerned with the study of the common basis of geographical regularities and the potentials of geography as a science. So maybe that's what the 1997 book is referring back to. But I mean, this wasn't a term that I heard in any classes or have read about until today.
No, I mean, the closest would be, and this is not even accurate, but semantic geography, maybe? That would be the closest idea that we did talk about in classes.
Yeah, but semantics are about how we describe the geography, not how necessarily we understand the geography. So I would even, I get where you're saying that it's similar, but even there, it's just different enough.
Yeah. It's the closest, but it's not right. It's not exactly it. It's an interesting idea. And you can see how, well, if you know the history of the Cold War, you can see a little bit, I think, of how the Soviets may be one of the ones to talk about this, to think about this, because the history of we have the Eastern Bloc and Western Europe, and we have East Berlin and West Berlin, and we have that sort of way of organizing Europe, which was the dominant, sort of arguably the dominant feature, without getting into colonialism, for much of the last couple of 300 years. So you could see how they would sort of approach this and think about, well, what does it really mean to think about Eastern Bloc countries, which, for those who may be unaware of the history of the Cold War, is following World War II, the Soviet Union sort of, what's the word? It's not annexed. They didn't formally annex it, but they certainly made
didn't
a line.
leave.
Yeah, they didn't leave. They made a line and they
This
said, this is our
basically
sphere
what
of
happened.
control. That's Poland, Romania, Hungary, the Czech and Slovak republics, which prior to that were made in Czechoslovakia, and then what am I missing here?
The Balkans.
Yugoslavia. Yeah, that area. They sort of said, this is our sphere of influence, and this is Eastern Europe as opposed to Western Europe. And if you're familiar with the geography of that area at all, it's kind of arbitrary where that line was at. There's no particular reason it has to be there. And of course, Germany, following World War II, it was the Soviet Union and the associated smaller countries going into Eastern Germany and taking over that area following the war, or to end the war, so to speak. And then, of course, the U.S., Britain, and France for the majority of the people moving into the West, other countries as well, but that's the majority one. And they sort of met in the middle. And then, like Sue said, the Soviet Union just didn't leave. So the United States didn't leave. And that's how we get NATO and Warsaw and all that sort of stuff. So you can sort of see how you would start thinking about this stuff, about how you think about this stuff. That was the history of Cold War in the beginning of the Cold War in 2 minutes? So
Sure.
Well, yeah.
I glazed over a lot of details. So just don't eviscerate me in email. That's
Well, you see it anywhere where people are, talking about and basically saying that what are we saying when we talk about different regions? A lot of people are reflecting on their own place in the world and how you navigate it. So it's pretty interesting because it's like Jesse said, what do we mean when we're talking about certain things, which is really a good thing to ask for anyone that's doing geography and geospatial work.
Yeah, I would say something like this. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure I would agree. Go say, well, this is metageography, but I think what they're trying to get at with it, the notion that our division of spaces, right, is much more than just simply what's across the space or what's across a map or something. That terms and the East-West one is a good one that you gave. I mean, I often have this discussion here with students in classes related to the word the South, the term the South. But it is a good way to think about how we have expectations for what these geographical terms mean, right? And those expectations aren't the same. So then how we then organize things based on that. Because one of the things about East and West, right, is that that's also an opposition, a binary, right, that predates even the Cold War. So when you have looking at the Far East, right, in the age of exploration, right, and thinking and seeing that as the exotic, the different, the other, right? And so, but also we now look at North and South differently. And so here we have divisions that have formed, but they are sort of geographic orientations. But if you ask many, many different people, right, even who think that they might share that definition, they will not. And trying to tease that out, right, can be really tough.
Answer this question: is West Virginia North or South?
Exactly.
And that's a perennial cultural question that the state itself struggles with, much less people outside of the state.
You also left out mid.
Yeah, right. And then there's additional qualifying terms. So I think that something like this, like the sort of, because if you go look at it, say, all right, I'm going to go to Wikipedia, right? This is one of those things that is much easier to maybe grasp in the examples than it is in the sort of definition of it. And so these are the kinds of examples. But yeah, I think in the north-south question, so I will always ask students, we do things often based on our perception. So what is your perception of the South? Like, where does it begin and end? I throw a map up and I ask them to draw a boundary. And immediately the arguments begin, right? Well, one person might have some familiarity to say, well, it's the Mason-Dixon line. And then, the rest of the class go, what even is that? Right? And they have to explain what that is. Some others will go, well, it's where it's really warm, or it's where, you speak a certain way. And then as they come up with their qualification, they see that there's a lot of difference there. But the amorphous concept of the South, right? And again, I'm keeping with a specific example, colors a lot of the ways that region is dealt with, right? And it finds its way into government policy. It finds its way into culture. It finds its way into economics. And so to kind of look at those things, it is just going beyond, say, a map that we can read and say, here's the boundary, right? Is that we're describing space and places with terms that are constructs based on our worldviews, and often in opposition. So the East-West, right, was set up as an adversarial kind of thing with the Cold War example.
What's interesting to me is I think, this would be an argument because I've seen this, but that this is playing out in things like the new National Geodetic Survey, where they've actually renamed what we would say as a datum as a spatial reference or a spatial framework for this very reason, talking about it's about the point from where we're viewing the world. So I think that there's some overlap there, or recognition of the world's vast, and we're trying to comprehend it, and we're bringing our own meanings to it.
Yeah, Jesse sent me down a rabbit hole by throwing this concept out. If you Google it down a bit, there's a book that came out in 2012 called Introduction: The Modernist Novel as Metageography, which looks very intriguing, and I may have to get a copy, but I like this bit, which is from a short story published in 1955. It says, an inmate got so badly caught up in the Pakistani-India rigmarole that one day, while sweeping the floor, he dropped everything, climbed the nearest tree, and installed himself on the branch, from which vantage point he spoke for 2 hours on the delicate problem of India and Pakistan. The guards asked him to get down. Instead, he went a branch higher, and then, threatened with punishment, declared, I wish to live neither in India nor in Pakistan. I wish to live in this tree. And it's kind of interesting, introducing the vertical to even this argument or discussion, maybe not argument.
So yeah, we have this term, and everybody's jumped on it very quickly. The question is, though, what does it mean to us today? And we have this area of geospatial technologies that we weren't really focusing as much on then. With the Soviet definition from 1969, there is that influence of the positivist / spatial science era. So there's a lot of different things that could be talked about here. We've kind of jumped on that cultural world geography kind of take that the Wikipedia article was leaning towards. There we go. So, thoughts?
It's interesting. The terms, I basically am trying to understand this concept within, like I did earlier, within the guise of things that I know or understand. So one of the ones that came to mind immediately was fuzzy boundaries. This notion that what is this versus what is that is a very ambiguous, fuzzy, non-determined, spatially inaccurate concept, as many cultural things are. It becomes very easy for us to understand when you're completely inside of a thing or completely outside of a thing. Like, we understand the difference between the middle of nowhere, Kansas, and the middle of New York City as being distinct from each other. But the boundary at which an urban area becomes or alters from an urban area into a rural area becomes a lot less determined or easily definable for most people. So that's one of the ways that I kind of thought about this, was that it's a little bit about what you see. It depends on where you sit and how it's very fungible and fuzzy.
Yeah, that's what I liked about it, because it adds multidimensionality and complexity to the discussion by bringing in the framework, the framework from which you said, and so allows for multiple layers of looking at something and questioning it, which brings us, I think, into thinking more geographically. And this is from a very quick overview of looking through research and literature, just scanning through.
We have all of these different directions we can go. What, I don't know, is this something that, again, it's something that I hadn't really heard of before. It's something I hadn't thought about in this context. I mean, these are all things that we had talked about in various other ways. I mean, everything from the map of grits to, the thing that Sue was talking about with different ways of defining where the South is and such. But, is this I don't know, is this a modern conversation to have in our area and era of environmental justice, social justice, sustainability that we're kind of in right now in geography? Where does this conversation of metageography play? Or is it kind of a colonial idea?
Let me throw another wrinkle into this, another way to think about metageography. And again, all I did was a Google search of metageography to figure out what was being discussed. There's a March 2000 article in, what journal is this? It doesn't matter. You just Google it. And it's entitled World City Network, A New Metageography, ? It's from the Annals and Association of American Geographers. What I think they're arguing is that the connectivity of urban areas become its own metageography, is how they're applying that term. So the connectivity of Newark and Baltimore, New York City and Baltimore and Boston, and DC, that becomes its own. I think in this term, greater geography, I think is what they're defining as a metageography. So I just throw that out there because, and they start off talking about connectivity and the connections, and they reference Gould, who says you cannot have a geography of anything that is unconnected, no connections, no geography. I think that there's a different way you could think about the term metageography. And I think that's an interesting way to start teasing at some of your question. Does this have any utility in the modern world? Maybe when we start talking about those connections, those interconnectivity, the metageography makes a little more modernistic sense to me.
When I was looking through, again, just scanning through, when there was talking about demassification, getting down to more, of the specific data and specific knowledge in a region, it made me think about the push in journalism towards, we don't need to talk about a region when we can talk now about specific places and use the correct terms, because the public with the internet has a lot more exposure to geographic literacy, geographic knowledge. And to me, this also seems like we can be talking about things in more specific sense than just the general idea of these regions, which have a lot of meaning attached to them, and step back by talking about the places within them as their own place. And I know that that's talked about in other areas of geography, but that's what I was thinking when I was reading through some of the information on metageography. I think focusing on the meta part, just like anything with meta that gives you more information that you need to talk about something.
I mean, that's what I've been thinking as I've been listening and looking at a few things and again, going from examples feel free to disagree and whatnot. But, we apply the term meta to something, right? Where we're suggesting we're going to go beyond from a starting point, right? For that. So what is kind of my question is, why use this term for a particular analysis when a lot of the examples that we've seen that we gave in this, that are even starting off at the very basic in the Wikipedia article, right? Those concepts. So I guess that is the question when you're doing a metageography, or when you're trying to use that term to characterize the perspective you're looking at, what are you moving beyond? So that's the part that I'm thinking, like, what would be, why would you want to use the term in something you're doing, or why would you want to highlight it? Because what is it telling you, right? What is different about what you're looking at? So the quote about the spatial relatively non-examined or unexamined yet spatial frameworks through which, we do things, right? So that's kind of one example. But again, I think that what is the geography that we're going meta on, as it were, or geographies? I think this would be multiple geographies. So I think that's the interesting thing to me. And as we're sitting here and I'm listening and thinking about it, that I'm working through myself, because I see kind of what's possibly being gotten at, right, and looking at these constructs through an example quite clearly. So clearly I'm seeing it as the example moving outward to kind of what is it then we're doing, but maybe not so much then working from the definition to a new case of it, if that makes sense.
So the interesting thing here is if you follow down the Google path long enough, you get to the original article, which was in a journal called Soviet Geography, which is kind of neat. There was a journal called Soviet Geography. And The Problems of Metageography is the name of the article. It was published in 1969. And metageography, this is the quote from the abstract, metageography is concerned with the study of the common basis of geographic regularities and the potentialities of geography as a science. I'm going to mess up this word. It's from linear algebra, but from the viewpoint of metageography, geographical space is the eigenspace of geographical entities. These entities are multiscalar, and they are universal threshold scales associated with different sets of irregularities. With regularities. From a geographical entity, it has two aspects. It reflects general laws, and it's unique. So in other words, what they're trying to do is they're trying to say this is a thing as opposed to this other thing, using concepts from linear algebra. And it's 1969, and it's, right around the initial fights between, as Marxist geography started to rise and we were looking at the quantitative, I don't even know what to call it at that point, is sort of ebbing of the power of quantitative and importance of quantitative, or the stranglehold really, into thinking about geography. This was essentially trying to say, well, we can talk about individual discrete units because they have spatial parameters that are cohesive. And we say, this is this and that is that. That's where it starts from. Hence the critique of critique of metageography in the 97 book or piece. I don't know if it was a book or an article, where they're trying to get at the idea of continents and saying, okay, well, does Europe as a continent make sense distinct from Asia as a continent? I don't know if they use that example, but this is clearly what they're kind of getting at, is that, does it really make sense? If you think about, as we move from east to west, there's a blending of things, and the distinction is a lot less fuzzy than you think. So it's an interesting term. And I really think that, to Jesse's question, does it have relevance? I think it's incredibly relevant. It's just not a term we use much. It didn't make it into the whole discourse of how we think about geography and positionality and power connections and all that kind of stuff.
So do you think it would have value as a way to bring together these types of analyses, of examples, right? Places where this idea that, and so you've given a couple of examples, but this idea, right, is that geographies that we are familiar with or talk about in a certain way, like regions, right? So that Barb mentioned regions, or using things like state boundaries. And by that, I mean actually country, states boundaries, right? Or those types of things from which we begin to talk about geography, then saying, well, we have these other concepts. And those are talked about in different disciplines. They're talked about in different subdisciplines of geography. So maybe a term like this is a way to focus some of that. Is that maybe some of its utility?
When you scan through the literature, I'm just doing a quick Google Scholar search, and since 2020, it's being used for things like you said, looking at a different perspective on public art territory, or geopolitics, or even physical hydrography boundaries. So I think it's almost like a term that signifies you're going to do some critical geography of how people have understood how a place is defined. It's also in historical geography, it seems to be used a lot for that. We're going to go revisit this idea of the map or the territory in historical geography, and I'm going to turn it on its head.
I think the term metageography, as it was originally defined in 1969, is to contradict myself, is the should die. It doesn't have a lot of utility, I don't think, because they in the abstract talking about us that we have to develop a calculus of spatial structures, and that's the only sound approach to the investigation of complex spatial systems. So basically saying, look, you need statistical analysis and math, and that makes it a science, and that's just all we need. And I think that we as a discipline have moved beyond that many years ago. It was, again, contemporary for 1969, but that idea we've kind of moved a bit beyond as being the only way to do this. But I think if we expand the idea of metageography to say we're starting to concern ourselves with some of these weird complexities, then it has utility.
Okay, so I think it got to what I was hoping it would get to, that we have multiple definitions of what this is, and they've changed over time, starting with the Soviet, with the VerySpatial science idea, through to ones that were during the resurgence of regionalism in the 90s, kind of showed that out. And then, as Barb was pointing out, our more recent ones are getting more closer to that modern idea of what geography currently is focusing on. But again, geography is all of these things. And so that's why I was humming while Frank was saying his last thing, is because there are people out there who very much want this to be a calculus of space, and think the rest of us who are doing weird human stuff are just wasting our times and things like that. So just as we think that they're kind of focused too much. And that's okay, because it's a big discipline. It's why we have a conference, with AAG that has 10,000 people at it. We have, events that are associated, like the Esri conference. That's what, 115 or 15 or 18 at this point. The IGC International Geographical Conference will be this August, and who knows how many people will be there. We have all these people coming from different directions in this massive discipline. And so a term like metageography that doesn't get talked about a lot has a lot of room to kind of slide from idea to idea, because it doesn't get talked about a lot. It doesn't get nailed down. And, we think metageography is going to be the geography of geography, but with maybe the exception of Frank's middle example, where people were kind of aggregating based on metageography, that would be the only one that was really about a geography of a geography. The rest have been more going back to Frank's earlier description of a semantic geography or an ontology or an epistemology type of focus. And so it isn't one thing. It's what someone needs it to be in the moment, right? Is anybody else? Or am I just imagining that?
What you're saying, if I may, is that geography has a lot of space.
Ba-dum-bum.
Yeah. But no, I don't think you're wrong. I think that I agree. I just got in trouble for saying that. I agree that metageography allows for the discussion of a lot of dimensionality to the discipline. And it initially was trying to make a science, right? And so I think that we've well established that there are parameters of geography which are clearly science in any definition. It's not the totality of geography, but it does exist. And so I think it somewhat met its goal. But the interesting thing is that this is where, definition of terms does matter significantly, because on the one hand, yes, it applies to a lot of different things, but that kind of means it doesn't mean anything also simultaneously. So we do actually have to sort of define our terms when we're talking about this. And that's a hard thing to do, because it does cover such a broad spectrum.
Because it's such a cool name.
It is a cool name.
Expect, it's a cool name. And so it can encompass a lot, and I was thinking, where did I heard meta? And then I realized it's the study of Facebook.
Well, but the other place more appropriately that would take you to the boring place is metadata.
Oh, I love metadata.
Yeah,
that's what I was thinking when I first saw it, and what I still think when I see it.
Yeah, but you're in the minority. Most people aren't metadata.
Well, hopefully everybody who listens to this podcast would have thought about metadata first.
I thought metaphysics first.
Oh, fair.
So
fair. Yeah, it's a fair,
I was
point.
leaning towards that.
So getting into essence and ghosts and things that aren't necessarily understood by the current physics.
Yeah, isn't that the take that See now
Oh,
here
that would be
we
really
don't even
cool.
necessarily agree on how we think they want. This is
But
my
that's just
thing
it, right?
with organizing terms, right? Is that this is attempting to define as any term like this is attempting to define the nature of the inquiry that's going on. To say that this is something that we can give form and substance to.
But as we were just saying, it doesn't, because everybody
Exactly.
disagrees.
Well, that's
or
exactly. That's the
agrees
paradox.
but takes their own spin on it.
Yes, exactly. But that's that's very similar to many other things. But yeah, so I was more thinking along those lines.
But yeah, so I don't know. Were there any follow-up kind of
Only
wrap-up
I have a
ideas?
follow-up to Sue that apparently the geography of the paranormal is spectral geography.
Nice.
I think she was thinking metaphysics more in the,
Oh.
ontology,
Yeah.
theology kind of
But
way,
even
not-
so,
Rabbit hole.
Yeah.
that's good to know.
So bring it back into a more heavily used, doesn't matter. We've talked about it now, so we can move on from metageography.
Well, now
Or
move on.
we won't. I don't know.
I
I
will.
don't know what will happen.
I will mull it, actually. I mean, again, I think that concrete examples of what is being talked about, we all kind of have applied in different situations.
No, we have.
yeah.
We just haven't talked about it as metageography.
As a yes.
I mean, the whole conversation around deep maps could completely.
It could be metageography. Absolutely.
So
There you go.
it's
It could be a meta deep geography conversation.
yes. On to the events corner. As always, check out these events if you're near them or not.
If you're in Salt Lake City, June 6th to the 8th, you can check out State of the Map US.
And the International Geographical Conference of 2024 will be taking place the 24th to the 30th of August in Dublin. It was just 20 years ago that we were at the IGC for Glasgow. And
Yes, just across
we
the
did not get abstracts in time for Dublin.
Yes.
So unfortunately.
And then,
we couldn't.
ironically, we went to Dublin after Glasgow was done.
During that trip. Yeah. So as always, if you want us to add your event to the podcast, send us an email to podcast@veryspatial.com.
If you'd like to reach us individually, I can be reached at sue@veryspatial.com.
I can be reached at barb@veryspatial.com.
You can reach me at frank@veryspatial.com.
I'm available at jesse@veryspatial.com, and you can find all of our contact information over at veryspatial.com/contacts.
As always,
We're the folks from Very Spatial.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
I grew up in Idaho, and I feel loved. Kissing in autumn's glow, rains they come and they go. What's not to love about Idaho? The secret is out, but no one knows. All of the heartbreak from years ago. Don't forget Idaho. I can remember when we sat on a back porch and stared out for miles. And now when we look out, we see bricks and tiles. What's not to love about Idaho? The secret is out, but no one knows. All of the heartbreak from years ago. Don't forget Idaho. lot to love about Idaho. The secret is out, but no one knows. All of the heartburn from years ago. Don't forget Idaho. Don't forget Idaho.